When we first moved into the house on Elderwood Lane, I wasn't sure what to expect. It wasn't much to look at: old bricks covered in ivy, windows that seemed to lean inward, and floorboards that whined like something alive. Mark, ever the optimist, called it character. I called it a fixer-upper. The price was too good to pass up, and we needed a fresh start after the year we'd had. The first night, it was just the two of us, a bottle of wine, and boxes stacked to the ceiling. We laughed off the strange noises, the pops and groans from the walls, the faint tapping sounds that came and went without rhythm. Old wood, I told myself. Houses settle. But the next day, I found the hole. It was near the baseboard in the upstairs hallway, barely the size of a dime. At first, I thought it was just a chip in the plaster, but something about it caught my attention. The edges were too neat, like it had been made deliberately. I bent down, squinting to peer inside, and for a second I thought I saw movement, just a flicker of something. Dust, probably. I mentioned it to Mark, who shrugged and promised to patch it over the weekend, but the next morning there were more holes, tiny ones, scattered along the hallway and into the bedroom. They weren't there before, I was sure of it. Mark insisted I was imagining things, but I could feel it. The way the air seemed colder near them, the way the silence deepened when I stood close. And then the whispers started. It was late, and Mark had fallen asleep in front of the TV downstairs. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, like someone muttering just out of earshot. I froze, holding my breath. It was coming from the wall. I pressed my ear against the wallpaper, my heart hammering. The voice was faint but distinct, a man's voice, low and rasping. "I see you." I jerked back, almost falling out of bed. My first instinct was to wake Mark, but when I turned to the door, he was already there, blinking groggily. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" I stared at him, unsure if I was losing my mind. "It sounds like there's someone in the walls." He frowned. "You've been watching too many horror movies." But the look on his face told me he wasn't entirely convinced. He spent the next hour banging on the walls, insisting there was nothing there. I didn't sleep that night. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Objects would move. A pair of scissors I'd left on the kitchen counter would vanish, only to turn up in the bathroom. The cereal box I'd just bought would be nearly empty by morning, though Mark swore he hadn't touched it. I tried to brush it off, but the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, until I couldn't ignore them. "Turn around. Don't look." As Mark and I got ready to sleep one night, the house was unusually quiet. We got into bed and both fell asleep pretty easily, even though I was still uneased. I woke up suddenly with a jolt and began to listen closely. I could hear someone humming from the next room. I froze. I couldn't even wake Mark up. I was completely and utterly petrified. The humming became louder, closer, until I saw the silhouette of a man in the darkness, only he wasn't standing up straight. The shadow of the man looked contorted, broken almost. The shock from seeing this allowed me to finally move, and I looked over to Mark and began trying to wake him up. "What is it?" he said in a groggy tone. "I just saw someone," I said, my voice trembling. "Not this again. We didn't even watch a horror movie tonight." He reached over to the bedside lamp and turned it on. Where once had been the man in the dark, it was now just empty space. "See? Nothing's there. Now please go back to sleep. You probably just had a nightmare," Mark said, swiftly turning off the lamp and closing his eyes. I started questioning myself and eventually fell back asleep under the idea that it had just been a nightmare. But when I woke up the next morning, last night's events were all but confirmed. I found a note on the kitchen counter, written in jagged, almost childlike handwriting. "I like your hair. It smells nice." My stomach turned. I ran to tell Mark, but he tried to brush it off, suggesting that I was still probably just freaked out from the nightmare last night. "Then see for yourself," I said, but when we got to the kitchen, I tried to show him, but the note was gone. The counter was spotless, as if it had never been there. Am I losing it? I thought to myself, highly disturbed. That same night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was Mark, but when I turned over, he was still beside me, snoring softly. The footsteps were faint, almost rhythmic, like someone pacing back and forth. They seemed to come from inside the walls. "Mark," I whispered, shaking him awake. "Do you hear that?" He groaned, rubbing his eyes. "What now?" "Listen." We both froze, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a low, guttural laugh. Mark jumped out of bed, grabbing the flashlight from the nightstand. "Stay here," he said, his voice trembling. He checked every room, every closet, even the attic. There was nothing. "It's an old house," he said, trying to reassure me. "You're letting your imagination get the best of you." But I wasn't imagining it. I could feel it, a presence, something watching us. Another note appeared the next day, this time tucked under my pillow. "You looked scared last night." "Don't be. I'm here for you." I felt sick. I ran to show Mark, but again it was gone before he could see it. He gave me a long, concerned look and suggested I take a break from unpacking. One morning, I found scratches on the inside of the pantry door. Long, deep gouges, as if something had clawed at it from the inside. Mark dismissed it as rats, but I knew better. Rats don't leave notes. The final straw came when I found the eye. I was alone, crouched by one of the holes, determined to see what was inside. I grabbed a flashlight and peered in, my heart pounding. At first, I saw nothing but darkness. Then, slowly, a shape began to take form. It was an eye, wide and bloodshot, staring back at me. I screamed, falling backward. When Mark came running, I tried to explain, but he just looked at me like I was crazy. "There's nothing there," he said, shining the flashlight into the hole. It was empty, but I knew what I'd seen. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to the house groan and creak, every sound sending a fresh wave of panic through me. Around midnight, I heard it again. The footsteps. This time, they were closer, heavier, as if someone was walking right outside the bedroom door. I grabbed the hammer from the garage and went to the largest hole in the hallway. If there was something, or someone in there, I was going to find it. The first swing sent plaster flying, revealing a hollow space behind the wall. I shined my flashlight inside, expecting to see wires or insulation. Instead, I saw him. He was crouched there, his body twisted unnaturally to fit the cramped space. His skin was pale, stretched tight over sharp bones, and his eyes. They were wide and unblinking, filled with a kind of madness I can't describe. He smiled, and then he whispered, "I've been waiting for you." I screamed, stumbling backward. The light flickered, and when it steadied, he was gone. The hollow space was empty. Mark found me an hour later, curled up in the corner, shaking. I tried to explain, but he just shook his head. "We're leaving," he said firmly. We packed what we could and left that same night, not bothering to lock the door behind us. As we drove away, I looked back at the house. For a moment, I thought I saw him, standing in the upstairs window, watching us leave. We stayed in a motel for a few days while Mark looked for a new place. I tried to put it behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still with us. I started noticing things. Scratches on the walls, objects out of place, food disappearing faster than it should. One night, I woke up to the sound of whispering. I turned on the light, my heart racing, but there was no one there. Another note appeared on the bathroom mirror, written in the fogged glass. "You can't leave me." Mark came in seconds later, but the words had already faded. I'm writing this now from another motel. Our third one this week. Mark is trying to reassure me, but I can see it in his eyes. He's scared too. I don't know what's happening, but I do know one thing. He's not in the house anymore. He's with us.